Born on December 7, 1928, in Philadelphia to Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants, Chomsky emerged from modest beginnings to become what many scholars consider the most cited living author and one of the most influential thinkers in modern history. His intellectual journey spans over 7 decades of groundbreaking research, political activism, and philosophical inquiry that continues to challenge established paradigms and inspire new generations of scholars and activists worldwide. The scope of Chomsky's intellectual contributions defies easy categorization, encompassing revolutionary advances in theoretical linguistics, profound insights into human cognitive architecture, systematic critiques of media and political power, and sophisticated analyses of consciousness and the mind-body problem. Among the most cited living authors, Chomsky has written more than 150 books on topics such as linguistics, war, and politics, establishing himself as both the father of modern linguistics and a major figure in analytic philosophy and cognitive science. This extraordinary productivity reflects not merely academic prolixity, but a sustained commitment to understanding the deepest questions about human nature, social organization, and the possibilities for human freedom and dignity. What distinguishes Chomsky from other major intellectual figures is the remarkable coherence underlying his seemingly disparate contributions to linguistics, politics, and philosophy. Rather than representing isolated scholarly pursuits, his work reveals a unified vision rooted in rationalist assumptions about human nature, biological constraints on learning and development, and moral commitments to challenging unjustified authority wherever it appears. This integration of rigorous scientific inquiry with principled political engagement offers a model for intellectuals seeking to combine scholarly excellence with social responsibility, though it has also generated controversy and misunderstanding among both academic colleagues and political observers. The historical context of Chomsky's emergence as a major intellectual figure proves crucial for understanding the revolutionary nature of his contributions. He began his academic career during the height of behaviorist dominance in psychology and linguistics, when human behavior was understood primarily through stimulus-response mechanisms and environmental conditioning. Chomsky developed an early interest in anarchism from alternative bookstores, becoming absorbed in the story of the 1939 fall of Barcelona and suppression of the Spanish anarcho-syndicalist movement, writing his first article on the topic at age 10. This early political awakening would later inform his mature political philosophy, while his exposure to rationalist philosophy through figures like Nelson Goodman and Willard Van Orman Quine shaped his approach to language and mind. The methodological innovations Chomsky introduced across his various fields of inquiry represent perhaps his most enduring contribution to human knowledge. In linguistics, he pioneered the mathematical formalization of grammatical analysis and the systematic investigation of syntactic universals across human languages. In political analysis, he developed with Edward Herman the propaganda model for understanding systematic bias in corporate media systems. In philosophy of mind, he advanced sophisticated arguments about the limits of human understanding and the misconceived nature of traditional mind-body problems. Each of these methodological contributions opened new research programs that continue to generate scholarly work and practical applications decades after their initial formulation. Contemporary relevance of Chomsky's work extends far beyond academic circles, influencing public debates about artificial intelligence, democratic governance, media manipulation, and human rights. His linguistic theories inform current research in computational linguistics and natural language processing, while his political analyses provide frameworks for understanding corporate influence on democratic institutions and international relations. His philosophical insights offer resources for grappling with questions about consciousness, free will, and moral responsibility that become increasingly urgent as neuroscience and cognitive science advance our understanding of human mental processes. This ongoing relevance suggests that engagement with Chomsky's ideas remains essential for anyone seeking to understand contemporary intellectual and political developments. Part 1. The Linguistic Revolution and Universal Grammar. The foundation of Chomsky's intellectual legacy rests upon his revolutionary transformation of linguistic science from a descriptive enterprise focused on cataloguing language variations to a theoretical discipline investigating the biological basis of human language capacity. This transformation began with his devastating critique of behaviorist approaches to language learning and culminated in the development of generative grammar, a mathematical framework for understanding the infinite creativity of human linguistic competence. Chomsky is credited with ushering in the cognitive revolution, a significant paradigm shift that rejected logical positivism and reframed how philosophers think about language and mind, positioning his work as rooted in 17th-century rationalist ideals. The emergence of Chomsky's linguistic theory can be understood only against the backdrop of mid-20th century behaviorism, which dominated American psychology and linguistics through its emphasis on observable behavior and environmental conditioning. Behaviorists like B.F. Skinner viewed language acquisition as a process of imitation, reinforcement, and habit formation, where children gradually approximate adult speech patterns through trial and error learning guided by parental feedback. Chomsky's 1959 review of Skinner's verbal behavior has been hailed as the most influential document in the history of psychology, serving as an emancipation proclamation for cognitive psychology that justified rejecting the methodological constraints of behaviorism. This review systematically dismantled behaviorist explanations of language learning by showing their inability to account for the creative and systematic nature of human linguistic competence. Central to Chomsky's critique of behaviorism was his observation that human language use exhibits properties incompatible with simple conditioning mechanisms. Children acquire language with amazing rapidity despite receiving limited and imperfect input, with speech that may be completely fluent and correct to the last allophone, while subtleties that become second nature to children may elude their parents despite high motivation and continued practice. This poverty of the stimulus argument became foundational for generative linguistics, suggesting that children must possess innate knowledge about possible grammatical systems that guides their interpretation of linguistic input. The speed and accuracy of child language acquisition, combined with the systematic nature of developmental errors and the uniformity of outcomes across diverse cultural environments, provided compelling evidence for biological constraints on language learning. The theoretical framework of transformational generative grammar represented Chomsky's most significant early contribution to understanding human linguistic competence. This theory distinguishes between deep structure, which represents underlying meaning, and surface structure, which represents actual sentence form, with transformational rules connecting these two levels. This distinction allowed linguists to explain how speakers can understand the relationship between sentences like "John is eager to please" and "John is easy to please," despite their superficial similarity, while accounting for the infinite creativity of human language through finite computational mechanisms. The mathematical precision of transformational rules provided linguistics with theoretical rigor comparable to other natural sciences, establishing grammar as a formal system amenable to precise analysis rather than mere taxonomic description. Universal grammar emerged as the most revolutionary and controversial aspect of Chomsky's linguistic theory, proposing that all human languages share fundamental structural properties due to biological constraints on possible grammatical systems. Universal grammar consists of a set of atomic grammatical categories and relations that are the building blocks of particular grammars of all human languages, with all children bringing the same biological endowment for language learning to the task of acquiring their native tongue. This hypothesis challenged prevailing assumptions about language diversity and cultural relativism by suggesting that beneath surface variations lies a common grammatical architecture shared by all members of the human species. The implications extended far beyond linguistics, offering insights into human nature, cognitive development, and the biological foundations of cultural transmission. The principles and parameters framework represented a major refinement of universal grammar theory during the 1980s, addressing criticisms about the diversity of human languages while maintaining core assumptions about innate grammatical knowledge. Rather than proposing identical grammatical rules across all languages, this framework suggested that universal grammar provides a set of abstract principles with associated parameters that can be set differently based on environmental input. The earliest incarnations of universal grammar in the 1960s took underlying structure of standard average European languages as their starting point. But linguistic comparisons among multiple languages began revealing exceptions that did not fit this neat schema. Languages like Walpiri, with grammatical elements scattered throughout sentences, and ergative languages like Basque, with different subject marking systems, challenged universal claims based on European language patterns. The biological foundations of universal grammar have generated extensive research in developmental psychology, neurolinguistics, and evolutionary biology, though with mixed empirical support. Arguments for universal grammar include language universals shared by all human languages, poverty of stimulus arguments about limited input, convergence of children on same grammar despite different experiences, and species specificity of language capacity. However, critics argue that there is little agreement among proponents about what universal grammar actually contains, with some seeing it as elaborate structure with many principles and parameters, while others propose it comprises just the structure-building operation called merge. Cross-linguistic research has revealed greater diversity in grammatical systems than early universal grammar theory predicted, leading to ongoing debates about the extent and nature of linguistic universals. Recent developments in computational linguistics and artificial intelligence have provided new perspectives on Chomsky's claims about the uniqueness of human language capacity. Machine learning systems now achieve impressive performance on various language tasks without incorporating explicit grammatical knowledge, suggesting that statistical learning mechanisms may account for more linguistic phenomena than generative theorists initially assumed. New research shows that young children use various types of thinking that may not be specific to language, such as the ability to classify the world into categories, coupled with unique human ability to grasp what others intend to communicate. These findings challenge strong nativist claims while potentially supporting weaker versions that emphasize general learning biases rather than language-specific innate knowledge. Part 2. Transformational Grammar and Syntactic Theory. The development of transformational grammar marked a watershed moment in linguistic theory, introducing mathematical precision and generative power to the study of human language structure. Chomsky's innovation lay not merely in describing grammatical patterns, but in providing explicit algorithms that could generate all and only the grammatical sentences of a language. This shift from taxonomic description to generative explanation fundamentally altered how linguists conceived their scientific enterprise, establishing syntax as an autonomous level of grammatical organization with its own principles and constraints. The transformational component allowed for elegant analyses of complex syntactic phenomena that had previously resisted systematic treatment, from passive constructions to question formation to relative clauses. The notion of grammatical transformations emerged from Chomsky's recognition that surface string of words often fails to capture the logical relationships among sentence constituents. Consider the relationship between active and passive sentences like John kissed Mary and Mary was kissed by John, which express the same propositional content despite radically different surface forms. Transformational rules provided a mechanism for deriving both structures from a common underlying representation, capturing the intuitive connection between related sentence types while maintaining the compositional interpretation of grammatical relations. This approach proved remarkably productive for analyzing various syntactic alternations across human languages, from dative shift constructions to topicalization phenomena to complex predicate formation. The theoretical architecture of early transformational grammar distinguished between phrase structure rules that generate basic syntactic configurations and transformational rules that derive surface forms from underlying structures. Phrase structure rules captured fundamental hierarchical relationships among constituents, establishing that sentences have internal organization more complex than simple linear sequences of words. The recognition that grammatical structure is hierarchical rather than merely sequential had profound implications for understanding language processing, language acquisition, and cross-linguistic variation. Children must somehow extract hierarchical structures from linear acoustic input, suggesting sophisticated computational mechanisms that go far beyond simple associative learning or statistical pattern detection. The notion of deep structure provided a level of syntactic representation where logical relationships among sentence constituents could be transparently represented, while surface structure reflected the actual pronunciation after application of transformational rules. This distinction proved crucial for understanding ambiguous sentences like "flying planes can be dangerous," which exhibits a single surface form but corresponds to two distinct deep structures depending on whether flying modifies planes or represents the subject of predication. The mapping from deep structure to surface structure via transformations captured systematic relationships between meaning and form that purely surface-oriented approaches could not adequately represent. This theoretical innovation influenced research in psycholinguistics, computational linguistics, and language acquisition by providing explicit hypotheses about mental representations of grammatical knowledge. Chomsky's analysis of English auxiliary systems exemplified the power of transformational analysis for revealing hidden regularities in apparently irregular grammatical phenomena. English auxiliary verbs exhibit complex patterns of inversion in questions, negation, and emphasis that seem arbitrary from a purely descriptive perspective. However, transformational analysis revealed systematic principles governing auxiliary behavior, showing that apparent irregularities follow from deeper structural constraints on syntactic operations. The auxiliary system became a proving ground for evaluating alternative theoretical proposals, with different approaches making distinct predictions about possible and impossible patterns of auxiliary behavior across human languages. The extension of transformational analysis to cross-linguistic phenomena revealed both universal properties of human language and parameters of systematic variation among grammatical systems. Phenomena like question formation, which involves movement of interrogative expressions to sentence initial positions in many languages, suggested universal principles constraining possible syntactic operations. However, languages differ systematically in whether they allow multiple questions in single clauses, whether they require overt movement of question words, and whether they permit questions from embedded clauses. These patterns of variation could be captured through parametric differences in how universal transformational principles apply in particular grammatical systems, providing a framework for understanding both unity and diversity in human language. The psychological reality of transformational grammar became a central empirical question as psycholinguists began testing whether transformational complexity correlates with processing difficulty or reaction time measures. Early experiments suggested that sentences requiring more transformational operations take longer to comprehend or produce, supporting the hypothesis that transformational grammar reflects actual mental computations involved in language use. However, subsequent research revealed a more complex picture, with some transformational relationships facilitating processing, while others create computational bottlenecks. These findings led to more sophisticated theories of the relationship between grammatical competence and performance systems responsible for real-time language use. The evolution of transformational theory through the 1970s and 80s reflected ongoing tensions between descriptive adequacy and theoretical elegance as researchers grappled with increasingly complex empirical phenomena. Early transformational grammar required construction-specific rules for different syntactic operations, leading to proliferation of ad hoc mechanisms that undermined theoretical coherence. Subsequent developments attempted to unify diverse transformational processes under more general principles, ultimately leading to the hypothesis that all syntactic operations involve a single movement rule subject to universal constraints. This evolution toward theoretical unification culminated in government and binding theory, which decomposed transformational operations into interacting modules with distinct principles and parameters. The influence of transformational grammar extended far beyond theoretical linguistics, informing research programs in computational linguistics, artificial intelligence, and cognitive psychology. Computer scientists developed parsing algorithms based on transformational principles, though practical considerations often required significant modifications to handle the computational complexity of natural language processing. Cognitive psychologists investigated whether children acquiring language show sensitivity to transformational relationships and whether language disorders involve selective impairments in transformational processes. These interdisciplinary connections demonstrated the broader significance of transformational grammar for understanding human cognitive architecture and computational approaches to language processing. Contemporary developments in syntactic theory have largely moved beyond classical transformational analysis while retaining core insights about the computational nature of human grammatical knowledge. Modern minimalist approaches attempt to derive apparent transformational effects from more fundamental principles of structure building and interface optimization. Construction grammar and usage-based approaches challenge the centrality of transformations while acknowledging the need to account for systematic relationships among related constructions. Despite these theoretical shifts, transformational grammar's emphasis on explicit formalization, generative adequacy, and cross-linguistic comparison continues to influence contemporary syntactic research and maintains its historical significance as a foundational paradigm in modern linguistics. Part 3. The Minimalist Program and Contemporary Linguistics. The Minimalist Program represents Chomsky's most recent and perhaps most radical attempt to understand human language capacity through the lens of optimal design and computational efficiency. Emerging in the early 1990s as a response to the perceived complexity of government and binding theory, the minimalist approach seeks to derive apparent grammatical principles from more fundamental considerations about the requirements imposed by interface systems. Rather than positing elaborate innate grammatical machinery, minimalism explores whether language can be understood as an optimal solution to the computational problem of relating sound and meaning through the simplest possible mechanisms. This represents a significant departure from earlier approaches that proliferated grammatical principles to handle empirical complexity, instead asking what aspects of grammar are conceptually necessary rather than merely descriptively adequate. The theoretical foundations of minimalism rest on the hypothesis that the language faculty interfaces with two performance systems: the articulatory perceptual system responsible for sound production and perception, and the conceptual intentional system responsible for meaning and thought. Linguistic expressions must satisfy legibility conditions imposed by these interface systems, providing interpretable instructions for pronunciation and semantic interpretation. All syntactic operations and constraints are claimed to follow from these interface requirements rather than from language-specific principles, suggesting that universal grammar might be much simpler than previously assumed. This interface-based approach attempts to explain apparently arbitrary grammatical phenomena as consequences of general computational principles rather than stipulated grammatical rules. The central operation in minimalist theory is merge, a recursive structure, building mechanism that combines syntactic elements into increasingly complex hierarchical configurations. Merge operates on items selected from the lexicon to create binary branching structures that can serve as input for further applications of merge, generating the infinite range of possible linguistic expressions. The simplicity of this basic operation contrasts sharply with the complexity of earlier transformational systems, reflecting minimalism's commitment to reducing grammatical mechanisms to their essential components. All apparent transformational effects are reanalyzed as consequences of merge operating under economy conditions that favor computationally efficient derivations over more complex alternatives. The strong minimalist thesis holds that language is optimally designed in the sense that it contains only features required by interface conditions, with no grammatical principles that exist purely for internal systematic reasons. This represents an extremely strong empirical claim about the nature of human language capacity, suggesting that evolution has shaped the language faculty to achieve perfect efficiency in relating sound and meaning. If correct, this thesis would have profound implications for understanding language acquisition, cross-linguistic variation, and the relationship between language and other cognitive systems. However, the thesis remains highly controversial, with critics arguing that many grammatical phenomena seem arbitrary from the perspective of interface optimization, and that perfect design is implausible given evolutionary constraints. The notion of phases plays a crucial role in current minimalist theory by defining domains within which syntactic operations apply and beyond which derived structures become inaccessible to further computation. Phases like complement phrases and tense phrases serve as interface points, where portions of syntactic structure are sent to pronunciation and interpretation systems, reducing computational load by allowing incremental processing of complex sentences. Phase theory attempts to capture locality constraints on syntactic operations while providing a mechanism for cyclic application of interface conditions throughout derivational process. This approach offers a more dynamic view of syntax as involving real-time computation rather than static structural relationships, potentially bridging the gap between grammatical competence and performance systems. The minimalist approach to cross-linguistic variation emphasizes the role of lexical specification in determining parametric differences among grammatical systems. Rather than positing abstract parameters that govern core syntactic operations, current minimalist thinking locates variation in the features associated with particular lexical items and their interactions with universal computational mechanisms. This lexical parametrization hypothesis suggests that children acquire their native language primarily by learning the feature specifications of individual words and morphemes rather than setting abstract syntactic parameters. Such an approach potentially simplifies language acquisition while accounting for both systematic cross-linguistic differences and the rapid pace of child language learning. Recent developments in minimalist syntax have focused on the labeling problem, which concerns how syntactic structures receive categorical identities that determine their distribution and interpretation. When merge combines two syntactic elements, the resulting structure must be labeled to specify whether it functions as a noun phrase, verb phrase, or other grammatical category. Chomsky has proposed that labels are determined by prominent features in syntactic structures, but this proposal faces empirical challenges from constructions where no single element provides an obvious label. The labeling problem exemplifies ongoing tensions in minimalist theory between theoretical elegance and descriptive adequacy, as researchers struggle to maintain simplicity while handling complex empirical phenomena. The relationship between minimalism and earlier generative theories remains a matter of considerable debate among syntacticians and psycholinguists. Some researchers view minimalism as a natural evolution that preserves core insights of transformational grammar while achieving greater theoretical unification and conceptual clarity. Others argue that minimalist eliminativism discards well-established empirical generalizations in favor of theoretical simplicity that may not be empirically justified. The debate reflects deeper questions about scientific methodology in linguistics and the relative importance of explanatory depth versus descriptive coverage in theory evaluation. The Minimalist program has generated extensive empirical research investigating whether grammatical phenomena can indeed be derived from interface conditions and computational economy principles. Studies of language acquisition examine whether children show sensitivity to economy conditions and whether developmental patterns reflect interface optimization. Cross-linguistic research investigates whether apparent syntactic parameters can be reduced to lexical variation, and whether interface conditions correctly predict possible and impossible grammatical systems. Psycholinguistic experiments test whether processing patterns align with minimalist predictions about computational efficiency and structural economy. Contemporary assessment of the Minimalist program reveals both significant achievements and ongoing challenges in the pursuit of optimal grammatical theory. The program has succeeded in unifying diverse syntactic phenomena under more general principles, while reducing the inventory of grammatical operations to its essential components. However, many empirical problems remain unsolved, and the strong minimalist thesis continues to face counterexamples from phenomena that seem arbitrary from an interface perspective. The future development of minimalist theory will likely depend on whether interface conditions can be refined to handle empirical challenges while maintaining the program's commitment to optimal design and computational efficiency. Part 4. Cognitive Science and Philosophy of Mind. Chomsky's contributions to cognitive science extend far beyond his specific proposals about language structure, encompassing foundational insights about the nature of mental representation, the modularity of mind, and the relationship between biological endowment and cognitive development. His work helped establish cognitive science as a legitimate scientific enterprise by demonstrating that abstract mental processes could be studied with mathematical rigor and empirical precision. The generative approach to grammar provided a model for understanding other cognitive capacities as computational systems operating over structured mental representations rather than mere associations between stimuli and responses. This computational approach to mind became central to cognitive science research programs in perception, memory, reasoning and problem-solving throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The concept of mental representation emerged as a core theoretical construct in Chomsky's approach to understanding human cognitive architecture. Unlike behaviorist approaches that avoided reference to internal mental states, generative grammar required explicit hypotheses about the abstract structures that underlie linguistic competence. Grammatical rules operate over syntactic categories and structural relationships that have no direct correspondence to observable behavior, necessitating a representational level of analysis that mediates between environmental input and behavioral output. This commitment to mental representation became foundational for cognitive science generally, influencing research in artificial intelligence, cognitive psychology and neuroscience by establishing the legitimacy of studying unobservable mental processes through their computational properties. Chomsky's rationalist approach to cognitive development challenged prevailing empiricist assumptions about the plasticity of human learning mechanisms. Rather than viewing the mind as a general-purpose learning device that acquires knowledge through domain-neutral mechanisms, Chomsky argued that cognitive development requires domain-specific constraints that guide learning in particular areas of human knowledge. The poverty of stimulus argument for language acquisition suggested that similar arguments might apply to other cognitive domains, where children acquire complex knowledge despite limited environmental evidence. This nativist perspective influenced research on numerical cognition, spatial reasoning, folk psychology, and moral development by encouraging researchers to investigate possible innate constraints on learning in these domains. The modularity hypothesis represents one of Chomsky's most influential contributions to understanding the architecture of human cognitive systems. Rather than viewing the mind as a unified cognitive mechanism that operates uniformly across different domains of knowledge, modularity suggests that cognitive systems are composed of specialized subsystems with distinct principles and developmental trajectories. The language faculty exemplifies modular organization through its apparent independence from general intelligence, its specific patterns of developmental emergence, and its selective vulnerability to neurological damage. This modular approach influenced research across cognitive science by encouraging investigators to look for functionally specific cognitive mechanisms rather than assuming domain general processing systems. Chomsky's emphasis on the biological foundations of cognitive capacities helped establish cognitive science as a natural science concerned with understanding the evolved structure of human mental architecture. The hypothesis that language capacity reflects species-specific biological endowment suggested that cognitive science should investigate the genetic and neural bases of human cognitive abilities rather than treating them as purely cultural or environmental phenomena. This biological approach encouraged collaboration between cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, and evolutionary biologists in investigating the development and organization of human cognitive systems. The search for neural correlates of grammatical knowledge and the investigation of genetic factors in language disorders became active research programs that continue to influence contemporary cognitive neuroscience. The competence-performance distinction introduced by Chomsky provided a crucial methodological principle for cognitive science research by separating idealized cognitive capacities from their implementation in real-time processing systems. Grammatical competence concerns what speakers know about their language, while performance concerns how this knowledge is used in actual speaking and understanding under conditions of limited memory, attention, and processing time. This distinction allowed researchers to study abstract properties of cognitive systems without being constrained by the complexities of real-time processing, while recognizing that competence theories must ultimately connect to performance mechanisms. The competence-performance distinction became influential throughout cognitive science as researchers distinguished between idealized cognitive capacities and their implementation in specific task contexts. Chomsky's approach to cognitive science emphasizes the importance of studying cognitive capacities in their own right, rather than reducing them to more general learning or processing mechanisms. This autonomy thesis suggests that different cognitive domains exhibit distinct principles that cannot be derived from domain general mechanisms or explained purely through environmental input. The linguistic evidence for syntactic principles that seem arbitrary from functional or communicative perspectives supports the hypothesis that cognitive systems may exhibit organization that reflects evolutionary history rather than optimal design for current environmental demands. This perspective encourages cognitive scientists to investigate domain-specific principles rather than assuming that all cognitive phenomena can be reduced to general-purpose mechanisms. The relationship between language and thought represents one of the most enduring questions in Chomsky's approach to cognitive science, though his position on this issue has evolved considerably over time. Early work suggested that language might provide the format for thought, with syntactic structures serving as the medium for conceptual operations. However, subsequent research indicated that many aspects of conceptual structure appear to be independent of linguistic structure, leading to more complex hypotheses about the interfaces between linguistic and conceptual systems. Current minimalist approaches suggest that language provides a mechanism for externalizing thought rather than constituting the medium of thought itself, though the precise relationship between linguistic and conceptual representation remains an active area of investigation. The implications of Chomsky's cognitive science for understanding artificial intelligence and machine learning have become increasingly relevant as computational approaches to natural language processing achieve impressive practical success. Chomsky's emphasis on the poverty of stimulus and the need for innate constraints suggests that successful artificial intelligence systems may require built-in biases rather than relying purely on statistical learning from data. However, the success of neural network approaches that achieve human-like performance without explicit grammatical knowledge challenges strong claims about the necessity of symbolic representation and innate grammatical principles. These developments continue to generate debate about the relationship between human cognitive architecture and computational approaches to intelligence, with implications for both cognitive science theory and artificial intelligence practice. Contemporary developments in cognitive neuroscience have provided new opportunities for testing Chomsky's hypotheses about the neural implementation of cognitive capacities, though the results have been mixed regarding specific theoretical claims. Neuroimaging studies have identified brain regions that seem specialized for syntactic processing, supporting modular approaches to language organization. However, the neural evidence also suggests more distributed processing and greater interaction between linguistic and other cognitive systems than strict modularity would predict. The relationship between abstract theoretical constructs in generative grammar and observable neural activity remains an active area of investigation that may ultimately require significant revisions to both linguistic theory and understanding of neural organization. Part 5. Political Philosophy and Anarchist Theory. Chomsky's political philosophy represents a systematic and principled approach to understanding power, authority, and human freedom that draws upon both classical anarchist theory and his own analysis of contemporary political and economic institutions. His anarchist commitments emerged during his youth through exposure to libertarian socialist literature and observation of functioning anarchist communities during the Spanish Civil War. These early influences shaped a political philosophy that consistently challenges all forms of unjustified authority, while maintaining faith in human capacity for rational cooperation and democratic self-organization. Unlike many political theorists who focus primarily on ideal institutional arrangements, Chomsky's anarchism emphasizes the ongoing struggle against concentrated power wherever it appears, whether in state institutions, corporate hierarchies, or cultural orthodoxies. The theoretical foundations of Chomsky's anarchism rest upon what he calls the burden of proof principle, which requires that all authority justify itself or be dismantled. This principle reflects a deep commitment to human freedom and dignity, suggesting that coercive institutions are illegitimate unless they can demonstrate that their authority serves human needs rather than perpetuating domination. The burden of proof approach differs from both liberal theories that assume state authority is generally legitimate and Marxist approaches that focus primarily on class-based exploitation. Instead, Chomsky's anarchism maintains skepticism toward all forms of hierarchy while recognizing that some institutional arrangements may be temporarily justified if they serve to expand human freedom and reduce suffering. Chomsky's historical analysis traces the evolution of anarchist ideas from Enlightenment rationalism through classical anarchist theory to contemporary libertarian socialism. He identifies key influences, including Wilhelm von Humboldt's emphasis on free individual development, Pierre Joseph Proudhon's critique of property relations, and Mikhail Bakunin's analysis of state power and revolutionary strategy. This intellectual genealogy situates anarchism as the authentic continuation of liberal ideals about individual freedom and limited government, extending these principles to economic and social relationships that liberalism leaves unexamined. The historical perspective provides contemporary anarchism with theoretical depth and practical precedents, while avoiding the utopianism that critics often associate with libertarian political theories. The relationship between anarchism and socialism represents a central theme in Chomsky's political philosophy, as he argues that genuine socialism requires the dismantling of both state and capitalist power structures. Traditional Marxist approaches that emphasize state ownership of productive resources ultimately perpetuate authoritarian relationships by concentrating economic power in centralized bureaucracies. Anarcho-syndicalism offers an alternative vision where workers directly control their workplaces through democratic assemblies while coordinating economic activity through voluntary federations rather than market mechanisms or central planning. This approach combines socialist concern for economic equality with anarchist commitment to decentralized decision-making, suggesting institutional arrangements that could satisfy both libertarian and egalitarian values. Chomsky's analysis of contemporary capitalism emphasizes its incompatibility with genuine democracy and human freedom, arguing that corporate power represents a form of private tyranny that undermines the democratic values that capitalist societies claim to embody. Large corporations exercise enormous influence over individual lives through employment decisions, environmental impacts, and cultural production, yet remain largely unaccountable to those affected by their actions. The concentration of wealth and power in corporate hierarchies creates systematic barriers to democratic participation while generating ideologies that legitimize inequality and environmental destruction. This analysis suggests that meaningful democracy requires not merely political rights, but also economic arrangements that give people genuine control over decisions that affect their lives. The critique of state power forms another central component of Chomsky's political analysis, though he recognizes important distinctions between different types of state institutions and their relationships to popular control. Democratic states may serve as temporary bulwarks against corporate power while providing social services and environmental protections that improve human welfare. However, state institutions tend toward bureaucratization and elite capture over time, requiring constant vigilance and popular pressure to maintain their responsiveness to citizen needs. The long-term anarchist goal involves replacing both state and corporate hierarchies with directly democratic institutions that eliminate the distinction between rulers and ruled through genuine participatory decision-making. Chomsky's approach to revolutionary strategy emphasizes the importance of building alternative institutions and expanding democratic participation within existing systems, rather than pursuing violent overthrow of established power structures. This evolutionary approach reflects both principled commitment to non-violence and practical recognition that successful social transformation requires broad popular support and institutional alternatives. Contemporary activism should focus on creating worker cooperatives, community organizations, alternative media, and other prefigurative institutions that embody anarchist values while challenging existing power relationships. Such institution building provides practical experience with democratic decision-making while demonstrating the viability of libertarian socialist alternatives to hierarchical organization. The international dimensions of Chomsky's political analysis emphasize the role of imperial power in maintaining global hierarchies that benefit wealthy elites at the expense of popular movements for democracy and economic justice. American foreign policy consistently supports authoritarian regimes and corporate interests while undermining popular movements that threaten established power relationships. This pattern reflects the structural imperatives of maintaining global capitalism rather than the personal preferences of particular political leaders, suggesting that meaningful change requires systematic opposition to imperial power rather than merely electoral politics. International solidarity among popular movements provides the best hope for challenging global hierarchies while building alternative institutions based on cooperation rather than domination. Chomsky's educational philosophy emphasizes the importance of critical thinking and independent investigation in developing the intellectual capacities necessary for democratic participation. Traditional educational institutions tend to promote passive consumption of approved knowledge rather than encouraging students to question authority and think for themselves. Libertarian education should foster creativity, critical analysis, and collaborative problem-solving while providing students with historical knowledge and analytical tools necessary for understanding contemporary power relationships. Such educational approaches serve both individual development and social transformation by preparing people for active participation in democratic institutions while challenging ideological systems that legitimize domination. The relevance of Chomsky's anarchist philosophy to contemporary political challenges becomes evident in movements for economic democracy, environmental justice, and participatory governance that embody libertarian socialist principles without necessarily adopting anarchist labels. Worker cooperatives, community land trusts, participatory budgeting, and similar institutions demonstrate practical alternatives to hierarchical organization. The growing recognition of corporate power and state capture in contemporary political discourse creates opportunities for advancing anarchist analysis and solutions to problems of concentrated power. Chomsky's political philosophy provides theoretical frameworks and practical strategies for movements seeking to expand human freedom and democracy against increasingly powerful and sophisticated systems of domination and control. Part 6. The Propaganda Model and Media Analysis. The propaganda model developed by Chomsky and Edward Herman represents one of the most influential frameworks for understanding how corporate media systems serve elite interests while maintaining an appearance of independence and objectivity. This model emerged from systematic analysis of American media coverage of international conflicts during the Cold War period, revealing consistent patterns of bias that favored official perspectives and corporate interests. Rather than viewing media bias as accidental or reflecting individual prejudices of journalists, the propaganda model identifies structural features of corporate media systems that predictably generate systematic bias in favor of powerful interests. This structural approach provides a more comprehensive and scientific analysis of media behavior than approaches that focus on individual instances of bias or assume that media systems naturally serve public interest. The first filter of the propaganda model concerns the ownership structure and profit orientation of major media corporations, which creates systematic incentives to avoid content that might threaten advertiser relationships or owner interests. Media corporations are large businesses owned by wealthy individuals or institutional investors who have particular interests in maintaining profitable operations and favorable business environments. News content that challenges corporate power, questions capitalist ideology, or promotes radical alternatives to existing economic arrangements, threatens these fundamental business interests. While individual journalists may maintain professional commitments to objectivity and public service, the institutional context within which they work creates systematic pressures to avoid content that conflicts with ownership interests, even without explicit censorship or direct editorial interference. The advertising filter operates through the dependence of corporate media on advertising revenue, which creates systematic bias toward content and perspectives that serve advertiser interests while avoiding material that might offend potential consumers or challenge consumerist ideology. Advertisers prefer media environments that put consumers in positive moods and avoid controversial content that might create negative associations with their products. This preference generates systematic pressure to avoid investigative reporting, critical analysis, or other content that might disturb audiences or challenge fundamental assumptions about consumer capitalism. The advertising model also creates bias toward affluent audiences who have greater purchasing power, leading to neglect of working-class perspectives and concerns that might not interest potential consumers of advertised products. The sourcing filter reflects the systematic dependence of corporate media on official sources and established institutions for information, which creates bias toward official perspectives while marginalizing dissenting voices and alternative viewpoints. Government officials, corporate executives, and other institutional representatives provide easily accessible and apparently credible information that allows journalists to meet deadlines and avoid accusations of bias. However, this dependence on official sources means that media coverage systematically reflects the interests and perspectives of powerful institutions, while excluding voices from popular movements, dissenting experts, or other sources that might challenge official narratives. The sourcing relationship also creates opportunities for powerful institutions to manipulate media coverage through strategic leaking, exclusive access, and other mechanisms that reward favorable coverage while punishing critical reporting. The flak filter describes organized efforts to discipline media outlets that deviate from approved narratives through complaints, boycotts, funding pressure, and other mechanisms designed to discourage critical reporting. Conservative think tanks, corporate lobbying groups, and other well-funded organizations monitor media coverage and respond aggressively to reporting that challenges their interests or preferred narratives. This organized response capacity creates systematic pressure on media organizations to avoid controversial topics or critical perspectives that might generate expensive and time-consuming responses from powerful interests. The flak mechanism operates through both direct pressure on media organizations and indirect effects on journalists who learn to avoid topics that might generate trouble for their employers, creating self-censorship that extends beyond direct institutional pressure. The fifth filter originally concerned anti-communist ideology during the Cold War period, but has since evolved to encompass other ideological frameworks that serve to marginalize dissent and legitimize existing power relationships. Anti-terrorism ideology has largely replaced anti-communism as a mechanism for discrediting criticism of foreign policy and domestic security arrangements. These ideological filters operate by creating interpretive frameworks that automatically cast certain perspectives as illegitimate or dangerous, while treating officially approved viewpoints as naturally reasonable and patriotic. The ideological dimension of media filtering reflects broader cultural and educational processes that shape how audiences interpret information rather than merely controlling what information is available, creating deeper forms of thought control that operate through apparently voluntary processes of meaning-making. The propaganda model's predictive power has been demonstrated through extensive case studies examining media coverage of international conflicts, domestic policy debates, and corporate scandals over several decades. These studies reveal consistent patterns where media coverage of conflicts involving official enemies emphasizes human rights violations and undemocratic practices while minimizing or ignoring similar violations by allied governments. Coverage of domestic economic policy typically reflects business perspectives while marginalizing labor voices or alternative economic analyses that might challenge corporate interests. Environmental reporting often emphasizes technological solutions and individual responsibility, while avoiding systematic critique of corporate practices or growth-oriented economic models that drive environmental destruction. Critics of the propaganda model argue that it overestimates the coherence and effectiveness of elite control, while underestimating the independence and critical capacity of journalists and media institutions. Some scholars contend that competitive pressures and professional norms create incentives for critical reporting that can overcome structural bias under certain circumstances. Others argue that the model fails to account for the diversity of media sources and the ability of alternative media to challenge mainstream narratives. However, supporters of the model respond that these criticisms often conflate tactical disagreements among elites with fundamental challenges to elite interests. While alternative media typically reach much smaller audiences than corporate media, and often depend on the same structural constraints that affect mainstream journalism. The evolution of media technology and the emergence of social media platforms have created new challenges and opportunities for both propaganda and resistance that require extensions of the original model. Digital platforms create new possibilities for direct communication and alternative media, while also providing unprecedented opportunities for surveillance, manipulation, and control of information flows. Corporate control of digital infrastructure and algorithms creates new forms of filtering that may be more subtle and effective than traditional gatekeeping mechanisms. The propaganda model provides analytical tools for understanding these new developments while requiring updating to address technological changes and evolving forms of media control and resistance. Contemporary applications of the propaganda model reveal its continued relevance for understanding media coverage of issues ranging from climate change to economic inequality to international conflicts. The model helps explain why media coverage of climate change often emphasizes uncertainty and individual solutions, while avoiding systematic critique of fossil fuel industries and growth-oriented economic systems. Coverage of economic inequality typically focuses on individual success stories and policy reforms, while avoiding analysis of structural features of capitalism that generate systematic inequality. These patterns reflect the ongoing operation of propaganda filters rather than accidental bias or individual failure, demonstrating the model's explanatory power for contemporary media analysis and its importance for developing critical media literacy among citizens seeking to understand their information environment. Part 7. Foreign Policy Critique and Imperial Analysis. Chomsky's analysis of American foreign policy represents one of his most sustained and influential contributions to political discourse, offering a systematic critique of imperial power that challenges official narratives about humanitarian intervention, democracy promotion, and national security. His approach draws upon extensive historical documentation to demonstrate consistent patterns in American international behavior that serve corporate and strategic interests, rather than the humanitarian and democratic values officially proclaimed. This empirical approach to foreign policy analysis relies upon government documents, diplomatic records, and other primary sources to construct alternative narratives that reveal the gap between rhetoric and reality in American international relations. The systematic nature of this analysis suggests that problematic foreign policy decisions reflect structural imperatives of maintaining global dominance rather than mistakes or aberrations that can be corrected through better leadership or reformed institutions. The historical perspective that informs Chomsky's foreign policy analysis traces the evolution of American imperial power from its origins in continental expansion through 20th century global hegemony to contemporary efforts at maintaining dominance in a multipolar world. This historical approach reveals continuities in imperial strategy across different political administrations and ideological frameworks, suggesting that foreign policy reflects systemic requirements rather than partisan political preferences. The expansion of American power has consistently involved support for authoritarian regimes that serve business interests while opposing democratic movements that threaten established economic arrangements. This pattern holds across different regions and time periods, indicating that humanitarian rhetoric serves primarily to legitimize policies designed to maintain favorable conditions for American corporations and strategic interests. The economic foundations of American foreign policy receive particular attention in Chomsky's analysis, as he demonstrates how diplomatic and military interventions consistently serve corporate interests while imposing enormous costs on targeted populations. American foreign policy systematically supports regimes that provide favorable investment climates, cheap labor and access to natural resources, while opposing governments that pursue nationalist economic policies or social reforms that might threaten corporate profitability. This economic analysis reveals the material interests that drive apparent humanitarian interventions, while explaining why American support for democracy and human rights remains highly selective and often contradictory. The global economic system, maintained through American military and diplomatic pressure, benefits wealthy elites in both the United States and allied countries, while imposing systematic disadvantages on popular movements seeking economic justice and democratic control over their resources. The role of ideology in legitimizing imperial power represents a central theme in Chomsky's foreign policy analysis, as he examines how intellectual institutions and media systems generate narratives that justify interventions and minimize recognition of their human costs. The development of doctrines like humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, and democracy promotion provides intellectual frameworks for legitimizing military action while obscuring its actual purposes and consequences. These ideological frameworks operate through apparent scholarly objectivity and moral concern, while serving to rationalize policies designed to maintain imperial dominance. The effectiveness of imperial ideology depends upon its ability to generate genuine belief among both policymakers and publics rather than merely cynical manipulation, creating cultural and intellectual environments that make critical analysis difficult and sustain support for policies that contradict stated humanitarian values. Case studies of American interventions in Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East and other regions provide empirical support for Chomsky's structural analysis of imperial power while revealing the enormous human costs of maintaining global dominance. The support for military dictatorships in Chile, Argentina, and other Latin American countries during the Cold War exemplifies the systematic prioritization of business interests over human rights and democratic values. Similarly, interventions in Vietnam, Iraq, Libya, and other countries reveal consistent patterns where humanitarian rhetoric masks policies designed to maintain strategic control and economic access rather than serve local populations. These case studies demonstrate that problematic foreign policy outcomes are not accidental but reflect the systematic operation of imperial power in pursuit of domination rather than cooperation or mutual benefit. The relationship between domestic and international aspects of American power receives sophisticated treatment in Chomsky's analysis, as he shows how foreign policy serves domestic elite interests, while domestic institutions support international projection of American power. The military-industrial complex creates powerful constituencies for continued military spending and intervention while generating economic benefits for regions and corporations dependent on defense contracts. Corporate media systems promote narratives that legitimize foreign interventions while marginalizing critical analysis that might undermine public support for imperial policies. Educational institutions train intellectual elites in ideological frameworks that rationalize American global dominance while suppressing historical knowledge that might encourage critical perspectives on foreign policy. The analysis of American relations with allied countries reveals how imperial power operates through complex relationships of cooperation and subordination rather than simple domination of weaker states. European and other allied governments often benefit from American global dominance while accepting constraints on their independent foreign policy initiatives that might conflict with American strategic interests. This alliance system creates mechanisms for legitimizing American interventions through multilateral frameworks while maintaining American leadership in crucial decision-making processes. The apparent cooperation among allied democracies obscures the hierarchical nature of relationships that prioritize American interests while constraining alternative approaches to international relations that might better serve global peace and justice. Chomsky's foreign policy analysis extends to contemporary developments, including the war on terror, drone warfare, economic sanctions, and other mechanisms of international control that have evolved in response to changing global conditions. The war on terror provides ideological justification for military interventions and surveillance systems while creating legal frameworks that bypass international law and domestic constitutional constraints. Drone warfare exemplifies technological innovations that reduce domestic political costs of military action while imposing enormous human costs on targeted populations and undermining international law. Economic sanctions serve as alternative instruments of coercion that can devastate targeted societies while avoiding the political costs associated with direct military intervention, though their humanitarian impact often exceeds that of conventional warfare. The implications of Chomsky's foreign policy analysis for democratic citizenship emphasize the responsibility of people in imperial countries to resist their government's international crimes while building solidarity with popular movements in affected regions. Citizens of powerful countries bear special responsibility for their government's actions because they possess greater political rights and access to information than people in countries subjected to imperial intervention. This responsibility requires active efforts to expose government lies, oppose military interventions, and support alternative approaches to international relations based on cooperation and respect for sovereignty. The development of international solidarity movements provides hope for challenging imperial power, while creating alternative frameworks for international cooperation that could replace relationships of domination with genuine partnership among peoples seeking justice and sustainability. Contemporary relevance of Chomsky's foreign policy analysis becomes evident in ongoing conflicts and international crises that continue to reflect patterns of imperial domination despite changes in specific tactics and justifications. American support for authoritarian allies, opposition to independent economic development, and use of humanitarian rhetoric to justify interventions continue to characterize foreign policy across different political administrations. The analysis provides frameworks for understanding current events, while encouraging critical examination of official narratives that serve to legitimize policies serving elite interests. Citizens armed with historical knowledge and analytical tools can better resist manipulation and contribute to movements for international justice that challenge imperial power while promoting genuine cooperation among peoples seeking peace, democracy, and environmental sustainability. Part 8. Manufacturing consent and social control. The concept of manufacturing consent represents Chomsky's most systematic analysis of how democratic societies maintain popular support for elite policies through sophisticated mechanisms of persuasion rather than overt coercion. Drawing upon Walter Lippmann's earlier observations about the manipulation of public opinion in modern democracies, Chomsky and Herman developed a comprehensive framework for understanding how apparent freedom of information can coexist with systematic bias that serves powerful interests. This analysis reveals that democratic forms of social control may be more effective than authoritarian mechanisms because they generate genuine belief and voluntary compliance rather than mere submission to force. The manufacturing of consent operates through cultural institutions, educational systems, and media organizations that shape consciousness and create interpretive frameworks that make elite policies appear natural and reasonable. The theoretical foundations of consent manufacturing rest upon recognition that modern democratic societies require popular legitimacy for stable governance, creating incentives for sophisticated systems of persuasion and thought control. Unlike totalitarian systems that rely primarily on repression and censorship, democratic societies must maintain appearances of free debate and open inquiry while ensuring that such debate remains within boundaries acceptable to elite interests. This requires subtle mechanisms that operate through apparently voluntary processes of education, information consumption, and cultural participation rather than obvious forms of propaganda or indoctrination. The effectiveness of democratic social control depends upon its invisibility to those subjected to it, creating the impression of independent thought and free choice while systematically channeling opinion in directions favorable to powerful interests. The role of intellectual institutions in manufacturing consent receives particular attention in Chomsky's analysis, as universities, think tanks, and research organizations provide apparently objective analysis that legitimizes elite policies while marginalizing alternatives that might threaten established interests. The production of expertise creates cultural authority for particular perspectives while excluding viewpoints that lack institutional support or conflict with funding sources. Academic disciplines develop methodological and theoretical frameworks that systematically bias research toward conclusions compatible with existing power relationships while maintaining appearances of scientific objectivity. The resulting scholarly literature provides intellectual foundation for policy debates, while ensuring that such debates occur within narrow parameters that do not challenge fundamental assumptions about economic and political organization. The educational system serves as a crucial mechanism for manufacturing consent, through its role in shaping the interpretive frameworks and cultural values that students bring to their adult political participation. Educational curricula emphasize particular versions of history, economics, and political science that legitimize existing institutions while minimizing exposure to alternative perspectives or critical analysis. The structure of educational institutions promotes passive consumption of approved knowledge rather than critical thinking or independent investigation that might lead to challenges to established authority. Standardized testing, credentialing systems, and other mechanisms ensure that educational success requires internalization of approved perspectives while discouraging dissent or creative thinking that might threaten institutional stability. The cultural dimensions of consent manufacturing operate through entertainment, advertising, and other forms of popular culture that shape consciousness and create identities compatible with consumer capitalism and political passivity. Popular entertainment promotes individualistic values and consumerist lifestyles while avoiding systematic examination of social problems or collective solutions that might encourage political activism. Advertising creates cultural environments that encourage competition, materialism, and personal insecurity, while discouraging cooperation, environmental consciousness, or other values that might conflict with corporate interests. Sports, celebrity culture, and other forms of mass entertainment provide distractions from political engagement while modeling hierarchical relationships and competitive values that support existing power structures. The psychological mechanisms underlying consent manufacturing involve the exploitation of cognitive biases and social psychological processes that make people vulnerable to manipulation even when they possess formal political rights and access to diverse information sources. Authority bias leads people to defer to expert opinion and official sources, even when such sources serve particular interests rather than objective truth. Confirmation bias encourages selective attention to information that confirms existing beliefs while avoiding discomforting evidence that might require fundamental reconsideration of political commitments. Social conformity pressure creates incentives to adopt mainstream opinions and avoid positions that might result in social isolation or professional disadvantage, even when such positions are supported by evidence and moral reasoning. The technological dimensions of consent manufacturing have evolved significantly with the development of digital media platforms that provide unprecedented opportunities for surveillance, manipulation, and targeted persuasion. Social media algorithms can create customized information environments that reinforce existing biases while exposing users to commercial and political messages designed to influence their behavior. The collection of personal data allows for sophisticated psychological profiling that enables precisely targeted manipulation tailored to individual vulnerabilities and preferences. The apparent democratization of information through digital technologies may actually increase the effectiveness of consent manufacturing by creating illusions of choice and participation while maintaining elite control over information infrastructure and algorithmic systems that determine what information reaches particular audiences. The effectiveness of consent manufacturing can be observed in public opinion data that reveals systematic gaps between popular preferences and government policies across a wide range of domestic and international issues. Surveys consistently show that majority of Americans support policies like universal health care, reduced military spending, and progressive taxation that conflict with elite preferences and are rarely adopted despite apparent democratic processes. International polling reveals that populations in many countries oppose their government's support for American foreign policy initiatives, yet such policies continue due to elite pressure rather than popular demand. These patterns suggest that consent manufacturing successfully prevents popular preferences from translating into political outcomes while maintaining legitimacy for policies that serve elite interests rather than majority will. The resistance to consent manufacturing requires sophisticated understanding of how these systems operate, as well as alternative institutions and practices that can provide different sources of information and frameworks for political engagement. Independent media, grassroots organizations, and educational initiatives can provide alternative perspectives and encourage critical thinking that challenges manufactured consent. Direct action and participatory democracy offer opportunities for political engagement that bypass institutions designed to channel political energy into harmless activities that do not threaten elite interests. International solidarity and cross-cultural communication can reveal the provincial nature of nationally manufactured consent while providing broader perspectives on political alternatives that may not be visible within particular national contexts. Contemporary relevance of consent manufacturing analysis becomes evident in ongoing efforts to manipulate public opinion regarding climate change, economic inequality, war, and other issues where elite interests conflict with popular welfare and environmental sustainability. Climate change denial and the promotion of individual rather than systemic solutions reflect systematic efforts to prevent political responses that might threaten fossil fuel industry profits. Economic inequality is presented as an inevitable result of technological change rather than consequences of particular policy choices that benefit wealthy elites at the expense of broader population. The analysis of consent manufacturing provides tools for understanding these contemporary examples while encouraging development of critical media literacy and alternative political institutions that could support genuine democratic participation rather than managed democracy designed to serve elite interests. Part 9. Philosophy of Mind and the Mystery of Consciousness. Chomsky's contributions to philosophy of mind extend far beyond his linguistic theories, offering profound insights into the nature of consciousness, mental representation, and the fundamental limits of human understanding. His approach to these questions reflects a sophisticated naturalism that avoids both materialist reductionism and dualist mysticism, while acknowledging the genuine mysteries that surround conscious experience. Rather than assuming that consciousness can be easily explained through current scientific methods, Chomsky argues that we may need to fundamentally revise our concepts of both mind and matter to understand their relationship. This position draws upon the history of science to show how apparent conceptual problems often dissolve when theoretical frameworks evolve rather than being solved within existing paradigms. The historical analysis that informs Chomsky's philosophy of mind traces the evolution of the mind-body problem from Cartesian dualism through Newtonian mechanics to contemporary neuroscience and cognitive psychology. Descartes initially developed a perfectly respectable scientific theory that posited mechanical principles for physical phenomena and a separate mental substance to account for creative and voluntary behavior that seemed incompatible with mechanical explanation. Newton's introduction of action at a distance destroyed the mechanical philosophy by showing that physical phenomena themselves require non-mechanical principles, thereby eliminating the conceptual foundation for distinguishing mental from physical phenomena. Contemporary discussions of the mind-body problem often ignore this historical development, continuing to assume that we have clear concepts of the physical world that can be contrasted with mysterious mental phenomena. The critique of contemporary approaches to consciousness focuses on their tendency to assume that current scientific concepts provide adequate frameworks for understanding mental phenomena. Approaches like eliminative materialism that deny the reality of consciousness, functionalist theories that reduce mental states to computational processes, and property dualism that treats consciousness as a special type of physical property, all assume that we understand what counts as physical or computational. However, modern physics reveals that our intuitive concepts of matter, space, time, and causation are fundamentally inadequate for understanding even non-mental phenomena. If we lack adequate concepts for understanding the physical world, then apparent puzzles about how consciousness relates to brain activity may reflect conceptual confusion rather than genuine empirical problems requiring scientific solution. The analysis of mental representation reveals another area where Chomsky's philosophy of mind challenges conventional assumptions about the nature of cognitive processes. Rather than treating mental representations as copies or correlates of external objects, Chomsky suggests that the mind actively constructs interpretations of environmental stimuli according to its own organizational principles. This constructive approach to mental representation has implications for understanding perception, memory, language comprehension, and other cognitive processes that involve the interpretation of information rather than passive reception of external input. The emphasis on mental construction rather than environmental determination aligns with broader themes in Chomsky's work about the active nature of human cognition and the limitations of empiricist approaches to understanding mental development. The question of free will and moral responsibility receives sophisticated treatment in Chomsky's philosophy of mind through his analysis of creative action and the limits of deterministic explanation. Human behavior exhibits creative properties that seem incompatible with simple mechanical causation, from the innovative use of language to artistic creation to moral reasoning that transcends environmental conditioning. While acknowledging that human actions have causal antecedents, Chomsky argues that our current understanding of causation may be too limited to capture the complex relationship between reasons, intentions, and behavior that characterizes distinctively human action. This position avoids both hard determinist denial of moral responsibility and libertarian postulation of causally disconnected choices by suggesting that apparent puzzles about free will may reflect inadequate concepts of causation rather than genuine metaphysical problems. The relationship between consciousness and language represents one of the most complex and disputed aspects of Chomsky's philosophy of mind. While his linguistic theories emphasize the unconscious nature of grammatical knowledge and processing, he also recognizes that language use involves conscious intentions, meanings, and creative choices that cannot be reduced to mechanical operations. The interface between unconscious grammatical competence and conscious language use remains poorly understood, requiring theoretical developments that can bridge the gap between formal linguistic analysis and phenomenological description of conscious experience. This interface problem exemplifies broader challenges in understanding how unconscious cognitive processes give rise to conscious experience without reducing either level of description to the other. The implications of Chomsky's philosophy of mind for understanding artificial intelligence and machine consciousness reflect his skepticism about computational approaches that ignore the biological foundations of mental phenomena. While computers can simulate various aspects of human cognitive performance, Chomsky argues that consciousness and understanding may require biological substrates that cannot be duplicated in silicon-based systems. This biological naturalism does not exclude the possibility of artificial consciousness, but suggests that creating genuinely conscious machines may require understanding biological mechanisms that remain largely mysterious. The question of machine consciousness thus becomes an empirical rather than conceptual issue, dependent upon advances in understanding the biological basis of consciousness rather than improvements in computational power or algorithmic sophistication. The discussion of other minds and intersubjective understanding reveals another dimension of Chomsky's philosophy of mind that connects with his broader social and political concerns. The ability to understand and communicate with other conscious beings seems to depend upon shared biological and cultural foundations that make empathic understanding possible. However, systematic differences in experience, education, and social position can create barriers to mutual understanding that have important implications for democratic participation and moral reasoning. The development of human solidarity and cooperative institutions may depend upon expanding the capacity for intersubjective understanding across differences in culture, class, and other social divisions that can limit empathic connection and moral concern. The Mysterian position associated with philosophers like Colin McGinn receives qualified support from Chomsky, though he emphasizes that apparent mysteries may reflect temporary limitations in human understanding rather than permanent cognitive closure. The history of science suggests that problems that seem intractable within particular theoretical frameworks often become tractable when new concepts and methods are developed. However, it remains possible that some aspects of reality, including consciousness, may permanently exceed human cognitive capacity due to biological limitations that evolution has imposed on our mental architecture. This possibility should encourage intellectual humility, while not discouraging continued investigation of consciousness and other apparent mysteries that may yield to future theoretical developments. Contemporary developments in neuroscience and cognitive psychology provide new empirical constraints on philosophical theories of mind while raising additional questions about the relationship between brain activity and conscious experience. Neuroimaging techniques can identify brain regions associated with particular cognitive tasks, but the relationship between neural activity and subjective experience remains largely mysterious. The development of more sophisticated understanding of neural mechanisms may ultimately require conceptual innovations comparable to those that transformed physics, chemistry, and biology in previous centuries. Chomsky's philosophy of mind provides frameworks for thinking about these developments while maintaining appropriate skepticism about premature theoretical claims and reductive explanations that ignore the genuine complexity and mystery of conscious experience. Part 10. Rationalism, Empiricism, and Human Nature. The philosophical foundations of Chomsky's approach to understanding human nature rest upon a sophisticated rationalism that draws inspiration from 17th and 18th century thinkers while incorporating insights from contemporary biology and cognitive science. This rationalist perspective emphasizes the active role of mind in organizing experience and the importance of innate constraints that guide learning and development. Rather than viewing the human mind as a blank slate shaped entirely by environmental input, Chomsky argues that meaningful learning requires pre-existing cognitive structures that determine what kinds of knowledge can be acquired and how environmental information is interpreted. This approach challenges empiricist assumptions that have dominated psychology, education, and political theory by suggesting that human nature includes specific capacities and limitations that constrain possible forms of knowledge and social organization. The historical genealogy of rationalist ideas traces their development from ancient philosophical traditions through medieval scholasticism to modern thinkers like Descartes, Leibniz, and Kant, who established systematic frameworks for understanding innate knowledge and mental organization. Chomsky particularly emphasizes the contributions of 17th-century Port Royal grammarians who developed early theories of universal grammatical principles, as well as 18th-century thinkers like Wilhelm von Humboldt, who connected language structure to broader questions about human creativity and freedom. This historical perspective situates contemporary cognitive science within a longer intellectual tradition, while showing how current research can provide empirical support for philosophical insights that preceded systematic experimental investigation. The continuity between classical rationalism and modern cognitive science suggests that fundamental questions about human nature transcend particular historical periods and methodological approaches. The critique of empiricist approaches to human development focuses on their inability to explain the speed, accuracy and uniformity of human learning in domains like language, moral reasoning and mathematical thinking. Empiricist theories that treat learning as association formation, statistical inference, or environmental conditioning cannot account for how children extract complex abstract principles from limited and often misleading environmental evidence. The poverty of stimulus arguments that originated in linguistic research apply equally to other cognitive domains, where human knowledge seems to exceed what could reasonably be derived from available environmental information. These arguments suggest that meaningful learning requires innate constraints that guide the interpretation of experience rather than passive absorption of environmental regularities through domain general learning mechanisms. The biological foundations of rationalist approaches to human nature emphasize the evolutionary development of specialized cognitive capacities that serve species-specific needs, while constraining possible forms of knowledge and behavior. Human cognitive architecture reflects millions of years of evolutionary pressure that shaped mental mechanisms for particular environmental challenges and social requirements. This evolutionary perspective suggests that human cognitive capacities are neither infinitely plastic nor arbitrarily constrained, but reflect adaptive solutions to recurring problems faced by our evolutionary ancestors. The study of cognitive universals across human cultures provides evidence for biological constraints on possible forms of human knowledge, while cultural variation reveals the range of environmental adaptation possible within these constraints. The implications of rationalist approaches for understanding moral and political development challenge conventional assumptions about the cultural relativity of ethical systems and political arrangements. If humans possess innate moral intuitions comparable to their innate linguistic capacities, then ethical systems may exhibit universal properties that transcend particular cultural contexts. Research in developmental psychology suggests that young children exhibit moral intuitions about fairness, cooperation and harm that emerge prior to explicit moral instruction and appear across diverse cultural environments. These findings support approaches to political theory that emphasize universal human rights and democratic participation while challenging relativist arguments that treat all moral and political systems as equally valid cultural constructions. The educational implications of rationalist approaches emphasize the importance of providing environmental conditions that allow innate capacities to develop properly, rather than attempting to impose arbitrary learning objectives through external reinforcement or instruction. Effective education should align with natural developmental processes by providing appropriate stimulation for cognitive capacities while avoiding methods that conflict with innate learning mechanisms. This approach supports educational practices that encourage active exploration, creative problem-solving, and independent reasoning rather than passive absorption of pre-packaged information or mechanical skill acquisition. The rationalist perspective also suggests that individual differences in learning may reflect variation in innate capacities rather than environmental advantages, requiring educational approaches that accommodate cognitive diversity rather than assuming uniform learning mechanisms. The relationship between innate capacities and environmental variation receives nuanced treatment in Chomsky's Rationalism, which avoids both genetic determinism and environmental determinism in favor of interactive approaches that emphasize the complex relationship between biological endowment and cultural development. Innate capacities provide the framework within which environmental influence operates, determining what kinds of environmental information can be processed and how such information is interpreted. However, environmental variation within these constraints can produce enormous diversity in knowledge, skills, and cultural practices that reflect the creative potential of human cognitive capacities. This interactive approach explains both the universality and diversity of human cultures while avoiding reductive explanations that treat either biology or environment as solely determinant of human development. The critique of behaviorist and associationist approaches to psychology reflects broader philosophical disagreements about the nature of scientific explanation and the proper methods for understanding complex systems. Behaviorist methodologies that focus exclusively on observable behavior ignore the mental representations and computational processes that mediate between environmental input and behavioral output. Associationist theories that explain learning through connection formation cannot account for the creative and systematic properties of human knowledge that seem to require more abstract forms of mental representation. The rationalist alternative suggests that scientific psychology must investigate unobservable mental processes and structures while maintaining empirical rigor through prediction and experimental testing of theoretical hypotheses about cognitive mechanisms. The implications of rationalist approaches for understanding creativity and artistic achievement emphasize the role of innate cognitive capacities in making possible the innovative recombination of elements within structured domains of knowledge. Human creativity operates within constraints imposed by cognitive architecture and domain-specific knowledge, while exhibiting properties that cannot be reduced to mechanical rule, following, or environmental conditioning. Artistic and scientific creativity may depend upon innate capacities for pattern recognition, analogical reasoning, and structural analysis that allow individuals to perceive novel relationships and generate innovative solutions to complex problems. This approach to creativity avoids both romantic notions of unconstrained inspiration and mechanistic accounts that reduce creative achievement to computational processes, suggesting instead that creativity emerges from the interaction between innate capacities and acquired knowledge within structured domains of human activity. Contemporary developments in cognitive science and neuroscience provide increasing empirical support for rationalist approaches to human nature, while raising new questions about the mechanisms through which innate capacities are implemented in neural systems. Research in developmental cognitive science reveals early emerging capacities for language, number, spatial reasoning, and social cognition that appear to reflect innate constraints on learning rather than environmental conditioning. Neuroscientific investigation of these capacities shows specialized brain systems that develop according to genetically guided programs while remaining sensitive to environmental input during critical periods. These empirical developments support the general rationalist framework, while requiring more sophisticated theories about how innate capacities are implemented in biological systems and how they interact with environmental factors during development. Part 11. Language acquisition and child development. The study of language acquisition represents one of Chomsky's most profound contributions to understanding human cognitive development, revealing how children accomplish the remarkable feat of mastering complex grammatical systems with apparent ease and uniformity. This achievement becomes even more striking when contrasted with the notorious difficulty that adults experience in learning second languages, or that computer scientists encounter in programming natural language processing systems. Children acquire their native language without explicit instruction, despite receiving linguistic input that is often fragmentary, contains errors and lacks systematic correction for grammatical mistakes. The systematic and rapid nature of child language acquisition provides compelling evidence for innate cognitive mechanisms specifically adapted for language learning, rather than general-purpose learning abilities that could, in principle, acquire any type of knowledge. The developmental trajectory of language acquisition exhibits characteristic stages and patterns that appear consistently across different languages and cultural contexts, suggesting universal properties of the language learning process. Infants begin by discriminating speech sounds and extracting prosodic patterns from the linguistic environment, demonstrating sophisticated auditory processing capabilities that are specifically tuned to human language. The emergence of first words around the end of the first year reflects the development of symbolic capacities that allow children to use arbitrary sound-symbol relationships to refer to objects, actions, and properties in their environment. The subsequent explosion of vocabulary acquisition and the emergence of syntactic combinations reveal the operation of powerful learning mechanisms that can extract complex patterns from linguistic input while generating novel combinations that follow systematic grammatical principles. The poverty of stimulus argument takes on particular force when applied to syntactic development, where children must acquire knowledge of abstract grammatical principles that are not directly observable in the surface structure of sentences they hear. Consider the formation of questions in English, which requires knowledge that auxiliary verbs move to sentence initial position in interrogative constructions. Children learning English must somehow determine that the question corresponding to "the man who is tall is hungry" is the man who is tall hungry, rather than is the man who tall is hungry, even though they are unlikely to encounter explicit evidence about the correct rule from their linguistic environment. Such examples demonstrate that children acquire abstract structural knowledge that goes far beyond what could be extracted through simple pattern matching or statistical learning from available input, supporting the hypothesis that language acquisition depends upon innate constraints that guide the interpretation of linguistic evidence. The systematic nature of developmental errors provides additional evidence for the operation of innate grammatical principles rather than arbitrary learning processes. Children acquiring English systematically produce regularized forms like goad and mouses that demonstrate the application of general morphological rules to irregular cases. These errors cannot result from imitation of adult speech, since adults do not produce such forms. Instead, reflecting the operation of productive grammatical rules that children have extracted from regular patterns in their linguistic input. The subsequent correction of such errors occurs without explicit instruction, suggesting that children eventually learn to restrict general rules to appropriate contexts through continued exposure to positive evidence about correct forms, rather than through negative feedback about incorrect usage. The universality of language acquisition across diverse cultural and social environments provides evidence for biological constraints on possible forms of human language, while revealing the remarkable adaptability of children to different linguistic systems. Children successfully acquire languages with radically different structural properties, from highly inflected languages with complex morphological systems to isolating languages that express grammatical relationships through word order and auxiliary words. However, all human languages exhibit certain universal properties such as hierarchical phrase structure, systematic sound-symbol correspondence, and compositional semantic interpretation that suggest constraints on possible forms of human language. The combination of universal constraints and parametric variation allows children to acquire any human language while ensuring that all human languages remain learnable by children with limited cognitive resources and environmental input. The critical period hypothesis proposes that language acquisition must occur during a specific developmental window when the brain is maximally plastic and sensitive to linguistic input. Evidence for critical period effects comes from studies of children deprived of normal linguistic input during early years. Second language learners who begin acquisition at different ages, and neurological cases where brain damage differentially affects language acquisition depending on the timing of injury. Children who acquire their first language after puberty show systematic deficits in grammatical development despite normal vocabulary acquisition, suggesting that syntactic learning mechanisms may be particularly sensitive to maturational constraints. The biological basis of critical period effects remains poorly understood, but may involve the progressive specialization of neural circuits that become less malleable as development proceeds, making early language exposure crucial for normal grammatical development. The role of social interaction in language acquisition has generated considerable debate about whether innate grammatical mechanisms are sufficient for normal language development, or whether communicative interaction provides necessary input for activating and developing linguistic competence. Children acquire language through participation in social interactions where linguistic forms are used to accomplish communicative goals rather than through exposure to abstract grammatical patterns divorced from meaningful contexts. However, the grammatical knowledge that children acquire seems to go far beyond what would be necessary for basic communication, suggesting that language acquisition involves mechanisms that are specifically adapted for extracting grammatical patterns rather than general social learning abilities. The integration of innate grammatical constraints with social communicative requirements remains an active area of research that may require theoretical developments bridging formal linguistic analysis with pragmatic theories of communication and social development. The implications of language acquisition research for understanding other aspects of cognitive development suggest that domain-specific learning mechanisms may operate in various areas of human knowledge rather than being unique to language. Research on numerical cognition, spatial reasoning, folk psychology, and moral development reveals similar patterns of early emerging knowledge that seems to exceed what could be learned through general-purpose mechanisms. These findings suggest that human cognitive development may involve multiple specialized learning systems that evolve to handle specific adaptive challenges rather than a single general intelligence that operates uniformly across all domains of knowledge. The modular approach to cognitive development has implications for educational practice, individual differences in learning, and understanding of developmental disorders that may selectively affect particular cognitive systems while leaving others intact. Contemporary research in language acquisition continues to investigate the biological mechanisms underlying early language development while exploring how linguistic competence develops through the complex interaction of innate constraints, environmental input, and general cognitive abilities. Advances in neuroimaging technology allow researchers to investigate the brain systems involved in language acquisition and how they change during development. Computational modeling attempts to specify how innate biases could guide statistical learning mechanisms to extract grammatical patterns from realistic linguistic input. Cross-linguistic research investigates whether acquisition patterns that have been documented for English and other well-studied languages generalize to languages with different structural properties, testing the universality of proposed acquisition mechanisms. The practical implications of language acquisition research extend to areas such as language education, treatment of developmental language disorders, and creation of artificial intelligence systems capable of natural language processing. Understanding how children naturally acquire language may inform more effective approaches to second language instruction that align with biological learning mechanisms rather than conflicting with them. Research on atypical language development provides insights into the organization of language systems, while suggesting intervention approaches that can support children with language learning difficulties. The challenges that computer scientists face in creating artificial systems capable of human-like language processing highlight the sophistication of mechanisms that children employ effortlessly, demonstrating the continuing importance of biological approaches to understanding human linguistic competence and its acquisition during development. Part 12. Intellectual Responsibility and Educational Philosophy. Chomsky's approach to intellectual responsibility reflects his deep commitment to using scholarly knowledge and analytical skills in service of human freedom and social justice, rather than merely advancing academic careers or serving elite interests. This perspective emerged from his observation that intellectuals possess privileged access to information, analytical tools, and public platforms that create special obligations to expose official lies and challenge unjustified authority. The failure of intellectuals to fulfill these responsibilities during periods of state violence and social injustice represents a betrayal of their privileged position and contributes to the perpetuation of oppressive systems that they could help expose and resist. The integration of scholarly excellence with moral commitment offers a model for intellectual work that serves human needs rather than merely advancing specialized knowledge or professional status within academic institutions. The historical analysis of intellectual complicity with power reveals systematic patterns where scholars and experts provide legitimacy for policies that serve elite interests, while contributing to the marginalization of critical perspectives that might threaten established arrangements. During the Vietnam War, social scientists developed strategic Hamlet programs and counterinsurgency theories that provided intellectual cover for military interventions while ignoring their devastating human costs. Economists promoted development policies that served corporate interests while impoverishing local populations, justifying these outcomes through abstract theoretical models that ignored empirical evidence of their harmful effects. The pattern of intellectual complicity continues in contemporary debates about climate change, economic inequality, and military intervention, where expert knowledge is deployed to serve power rather than truth or human welfare. The concept of the responsibility of intellectuals emphasizes that those with education, leisure, and access to information bear special obligations to investigate and expose the gap between official rhetoric and actual policy consequences. Intellectuals cannot claim ignorance about the effects of policies they have the resources to investigate, nor can they remain neutral when their silence contributes to public misunderstanding of issues with profound human consequences. The responsibility extends beyond merely providing accurate information to include active efforts to make such information accessible to broader publics and to challenge institutional mechanisms that prevent critical analysis from reaching public debate. This activist conception of intellectual responsibility conflicts with professional norms that emphasize detached objectivity and specialized expertise while avoiding broader questions about the social consequences of intellectual work. The educational philosophy that emerges from Chomsky's approach to intellectual responsibility emphasizes the development of critical thinking, independent investigation, and moral reasoning rather than passive absorption of approved knowledge or professional training for predetermined social roles. Traditional educational approaches that emphasize rote learning, standardized testing, and hierarchical classroom relationships prepare students for subordinate roles in existing institutional structures rather than developing capacities for democratic participation and social transformation. Libertarian education should encourage questioning of authority, creative problem-solving, and collaborative inquiry while providing students with historical knowledge and analytical tools necessary for understanding contemporary social and political arrangements. The goal is to develop autonomous individuals capable of thinking for themselves while working cooperatively with others to create more just and sustainable social institutions. The critique of contemporary educational institutions reveals how they serve to reproduce existing class relationships and ideological commitments while maintaining appearances of meritocratic opportunity and intellectual freedom. The structure of educational funding, curriculum design, and credentialing systems ensures that educational success requires conformity to approved perspectives while discouraging critical analysis that might challenge fundamental assumptions about economic and political organization. Higher education increasingly functions as job training for corporate employment, rather than developing capacities for independent thought and democratic participation. The growing influence of corporate funding and market-oriented approaches to educational policy threatens to eliminate educational spaces where critical inquiry and social criticism can flourish independent of immediate economic utility. The relationship between education and democracy requires educational approaches that develop capacities for critical analysis, historical understanding, and moral reasoning that citizens need for meaningful participation in democratic institutions. Democratic participation requires more than technical knowledge or professional skills, but also understanding of how power operates, historical awareness of alternatives to current arrangements, and moral commitment to human dignity and freedom. Educational systems that emphasize competition, individual achievement, and passive consumption of information prepare students for participation in hierarchical institutions rather than democratic cooperation and collective problem-solving. The development of democratic education requires fundamental changes in educational philosophy and practice that emphasize collaboration, critical inquiry, and active engagement with social and political issues, rather than preparation for predetermined economic roles. The analysis of media literacy and critical information skills becomes crucial in contemporary contexts, where citizens must navigate complex information environments dominated by corporate media systems and sophisticated propaganda techniques. Traditional approaches to media literacy that emphasize source evaluation and fact-checking, while valuable, are insufficient for understanding systematic patterns of bias and omission that characterize corporate media coverage of politically sensitive topics. Critical media analysis requires understanding of the structural factors that shape media content, including ownership patterns, advertising dependence, and sourcing relationships that create predictable bias in favor of powerful interests. The development of alternative media institutions and independent information sources provides necessary supplements to corporate media while requiring citizens to develop more sophisticated analytical skills for evaluating information from diverse sources with varying degrees of credibility and bias. The international dimensions of educational philosophy emphasize the importance of developing global perspectives and solidarity that transcend narrow nationalism, while recognizing the particular responsibilities that citizens bear for policies of their own governments. Educational systems typically promote nationalist ideologies that encourage support for official foreign policy while minimizing knowledge of international perspectives that might challenge such policies. Global citizenship requires understanding of how domestic policies affect people in other countries, as well as appreciation for diverse cultural approaches to social organization and problem-solving. The development of international solidarity among educated populations provides hope for challenging global systems of domination while building alternative institutions based on cooperation and mutual aid, rather than competition and exploitation. The practical implications of Chomsky's educational philosophy can be observed in alternative educational institutions and pedagogical approaches that emphasize democratic participation, critical analysis, and social engagement. Democratic schools that give students substantial control over their learning while encouraging collaborative investigation of real-world problems demonstrate alternatives to hierarchical educational relationships. Popular education programs that combine literacy development with critical analysis of social conditions show how education can serve movements for social justice rather than merely reproducing existing power relationships. The integration of community engagement with academic learning provides opportunities for students to apply theoretical knowledge to practical problems while developing commitments to social responsibility and democratic participation. Contemporary challenges to educational freedom, including corporate influence, ideological censorship, and surveillance technologies, require renewed commitment to defending intellectual independence and critical inquiry against pressures that would subordinate education to narrow economic or political interests. The marketization of education threatens to eliminate educational activities that do not produce immediately measurable economic outcomes while reducing complex learning relationships to consumer transactions. Political pressures to avoid controversial topics or perspectives limit educational freedom while preventing students from developing capacities for independent analysis of sensitive social and political issues. The defense of educational integrity requires active resistance to these pressures, while building alternative educational institutions and practices that can preserve spaces for critical inquiry and democratic education in the face of systematic efforts to subordinate education to power and profit. Part 13. Technology, Artificial Intelligence, and Human Creativity. Chomsky's analysis of technology and artificial intelligence reflects his broader philosophical commitments to understanding human nature while maintaining appropriate skepticism about technological solutions to fundamental social and political problems. His approach emphasizes the qualitative differences between human cognitive capacities and computational processes, while recognizing both the potential benefits and dangers of artificial intelligence systems. Rather than treating technological development as inevitably progressive or necessarily threatening, Chomsky examines how particular technologies are developed and deployed within existing power structures that shape their social consequences. This analysis reveals that the benefits and harms of technological innovation depend largely upon the institutional context within which technology is developed, rather than inherent properties of particular technological systems. The theoretical foundations of Chomsky's approach to artificial intelligence draw upon his linguistic research to highlight fundamental differences between human language use and computational language processing systems. Human language exhibits creative properties that allow speakers to produce and understand novel expressions that are appropriate to particular contexts while following systematic grammatical principles. Current artificial intelligence systems achieve impressive performance on various language tasks through statistical pattern recognition and large-scale data processing rather than through understanding of meaning or systematic knowledge of grammatical principles. The apparent success of these systems on practical tasks may mask fundamental limitations in their ability to achieve genuine understanding or creative use of language that characterizes human linguistic competence. The distinction between competence and performance becomes particularly important for evaluating claims about artificial intelligence capabilities and their relationship to human cognitive abilities. Computational systems may simulate aspects of human linguistic or cognitive performance without possessing the underlying competence that makes such performance possible in humans. The difference between simulation and genuine understanding has profound implications for questions about machine consciousness, moral responsibility of artificial systems, and the potential for artificial intelligence to replace human judgment in complex decision-making contexts. Chomsky's emphasis on this distinction encourages careful evaluation of artificial intelligence claims while avoiding both uncritical acceptance of technological hype and reflexive opposition to beneficial applications of computational technology. The analysis of creativity in human cognition provides another lens through which Chomsky examines the limitations and possibilities of artificial intelligence systems. Human creativity operates within structured domains of knowledge, while exhibiting properties that cannot be reduced to mechanical rule following or random recombination of existing elements. Scientific discovery, artistic creation, and innovative problem-solving involve the recognition of novel patterns and relationships that emerge from deep understanding of particular domains rather than surface-level manipulation of symbols or data. The creative use of language exemplifies this process through speakers' ability to produce expressions that are simultaneously novel and appropriate to particular communicative contexts, while following systematic grammatical principles that constrain possible linguistic forms. The social and political implications of artificial intelligence development receive particular attention in Chomsky's analysis, as he examines how current technological trends serve existing power relationships rather than promoting democratic participation or human freedom. The development of artificial intelligence systems within corporate and military institutions ensures that such systems will be designed to serve elite interests rather than broader human needs for knowledge, communication, and creative expression. Surveillance technologies, algorithmic decision-making systems, and automated warfare capabilities demonstrate how artificial intelligence can be deployed to enhance social control and military dominance rather than expanding human capabilities or solving pressing social problems. The concentration of technological development within powerful institutions limits the potential for artificial intelligence to serve democratic purposes while creating new forms of inequality and social control. The economic implications of artificial intelligence and automation raise fundamental questions about the organization of work and the distribution of productive resources that connect to broader themes in Chomsky's political analysis. Technological unemployment resulting from automation could provide opportunities for reducing necessary labor time while expanding human freedom for creative and fulfilling activities. However, within current economic arrangements, technological displacement of workers typically results in unemployment, inequality, and social disruption, rather than shared benefits from increased productivity. The realization of beneficial potential from technological development requires fundamental changes in economic and political institutions that ensure technological benefits serve human needs rather than concentrating wealth and power among those who own and control technological systems. The implications for education and human development emerge from Chomsky's analysis of how technological systems might complement rather than replace human cognitive capacities. Educational technology should enhance human learning and creativity rather than replacing human teachers or reducing education to mechanical skill acquisition and information transfer. The most beneficial educational applications of technology involve providing tools that amplify human cognitive capacities while preserving the social relationships and creative engagement that characterize effective learning environments. However, current trends toward online learning, standardized assessment, and algorithmic personalization often reduce educational relationships to technological mediated transactions that undermine the collaborative and creative aspects of human learning and development. The philosophical implications of artificial intelligence research for understanding human nature and consciousness reflect ongoing debates about the relationship between biological and computational approaches to cognition. The success of artificial intelligence systems in performing tasks that seem to require intelligence or understanding raises questions about whether consciousness and creativity are unique to biological systems or could emerge from sufficiently complex computational processes. Chomsky's analysis suggests that these questions cannot be answered through computational achievements alone, but require deeper understanding of the biological mechanisms that underlie human consciousness and creativity. The attribution of consciousness or understanding to artificial systems may reflect projection of human categories onto computational processes, rather than genuine evidence for machine consciousness or intelligence comparable to human cognitive capacities. The environmental implications of artificial intelligence development include both potential benefits from improved resource management and efficiency, as well as substantial costs from energy-intensive computational requirements and technological waste production. Large-scale artificial intelligence systems require enormous computational resources that consume significant energy, while producing electronic waste and other environmental impacts associated with technological production and disposal. The environmental costs of artificial intelligence development often remain hidden, while potential environmental benefits receive greater attention in public discussions of technological innovation. Sustainable approaches to technological development require careful assessment of environmental impacts while ensuring that technological solutions to environmental problems do not create greater environmental costs than the problems they are intended to solve. Contemporary developments in artificial intelligence continue to raise questions that connect with fundamental themes in Chomsky's intellectual work, including the nature of human knowledge, the relationship between biological and computational processes, and the social consequences of technological innovation. The rapid advancement of large language models and other artificial intelligence systems provides opportunities for testing theoretical claims about language, learning, and creativity, while raising practical questions about employment, education, and social control. The future development of artificial intelligence will likely depend upon resolution of fundamental questions about human cognitive architecture and consciousness that remain central to Chomsky's research program. The social consequences of artificial intelligence will depend even more crucially upon political and economic changes that could ensure technological development serves human freedom and dignity, rather than concentrating power and wealth among technological elites who control artificial intelligence systems. Part 14. Environmental Crisis and Social Justice. Chomsky's analysis of environmental crisis reflects his broader understanding of how concentrations of power and wealth create systematic barriers to addressing collective challenges that require coordinated action and long-term planning. The environmental destruction associated with industrial capitalism emerges from structural imperatives for endless growth and profit maximization that conflict with ecological sustainability and long-term human welfare. Corporate power and short-term profit motives prevent the kind of rational planning and international cooperation that would be necessary to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and other environmental crises that threaten human civilization. The failure to address environmental challenges reflects broader failures of democratic institutions that remain subordinated to corporate interests, rather than serving popular needs for a sustainable and healthy environment. The relationship between environmental degradation and social inequality reveals how environmental harms disproportionately affect poor and marginalized populations who lack political power to protect themselves from pollution, resource extraction, and climate impacts. Wealthy populations can often insulate themselves from environmental harms through residential choices, consumer purchases, and political influence, while imposing environmental costs on those with fewer resources and less political power. Environmental racism and environmental classism operate through systematic patterns where toxic facilities, extractive industries, and other sources of environmental harm are concentrated in communities that lack political influence to resist such impositions. The struggle for environmental justice thus becomes inseparable from broader struggles against inequality and undemocratic power structures that allow some populations to impose environmental costs on others without their consent or compensation. The analysis of climate change reveals how corporate power and ideological manipulation prevent rational responses to scientifically well-established threats that require immediate and substantial changes in energy systems and economic priorities. Fossil fuel corporations have systematically funded climate denial, promoted false scientific controversies, and lobbied against policies that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions despite internal company research confirming the reality and severity of climate risks. The success of corporate propaganda in delaying climate action demonstrates the effectiveness of systematic misinformation campaigns, while revealing the inadequacy of democratic institutions for addressing problems that conflict with powerful economic interests. The climate crisis thus exemplifies broader problems with corporate power and media manipulation that prevent rational policy making in areas where corporate interests conflict with human survival and welfare. The international dimensions of environmental crisis reflect broader patterns of global inequality and imperial domination, where wealthy nations export environmental costs to poorer countries while consuming disproportionate shares of global resources. The global carbon footprint of wealthy populations far exceeds that of poor populations. Yet climate impacts disproportionately affect countries and regions that have contributed least to the problem. International trade arrangements allow wealthy countries to import resources and export pollution while maintaining higher environmental standards within their own borders at the expense of environmental degradation elsewhere. Environmental imperialism operates through economic and political mechanisms that allow powerful countries to impose environmental costs on weaker nations, while claiming moral authority through domestic environmental regulations that merely displace rather than reduce overall environmental impacts. The technological dimensions of environmental crisis require careful analysis of how particular technologies are developed and deployed rather than assuming that technological innovation will automatically solve environmental problems. Many proposed technological solutions to environmental problems serve corporate interests rather than environmental protection by maintaining profitable patterns of consumption and production while providing apparent responses to environmental concerns. Nuclear power, carbon capture and storage, and other large-scale technological approaches often require enormous capital investments that benefit corporate contractors, while imposing risks on local populations and future generations. Genuine environmental solutions may require simpler technological approaches combined with fundamental changes in consumption patterns and economic priorities that conflict with corporate interests in maintaining current patterns of production and profit. The role of consumer culture and advertising in promoting unsustainable consumption patterns reveals another dimension of how corporate power undermines environmental protection through the systematic manipulation of desires and identities. Advertising industries spend enormous resources promoting consumption, planned obsolescence, and status competition that drive environmental destruction while providing psychological satisfaction through material acquisition rather than meaningful social relationships or creative activity. The environmental costs of consumer culture remain largely hidden from consumers, while the environmental benefits of reduced consumption are systematically discouraged through cultural messages that equate personal worth with material possessions and economic growth. Environmental sustainability may require fundamental changes in cultural values and social organization that prioritize human well-being and ecological health over material accumulation and economic expansion. The analysis of environmental movements reveals both their potential for creating alternative institutions and their limitations within current political and economic systems that systematically favor corporate interests over environmental protection. Grassroots environmental movements have achieved important victories in preventing particular destructive projects while raising public awareness about environmental issues and developing alternative approaches to energy, agriculture, and community development. However, the institutionalization of environmental organizations through foundation funding and professional staff often leads to moderation of environmental demands and acceptance of compromise solutions that maintain fundamental structures driving environmental destruction. The most effective environmental activism may require connection with broader movements for economic democracy and social justice that can challenge the power structures responsible for environmental degradation rather than merely seeking reforms that leave such structures intact. The relationship between environmental crisis and democratic participation reflects broader themes in Chomsky's political analysis about the need for genuine democratic institutions that can respond to popular needs and long-term collective interests rather than short-term corporate profits. Environmental protection requires long-term planning and coordinated action that conflicts with corporate imperatives for quarterly profit maximization and competitive advantage in global markets. Democratic institutions that remain subordinated to corporate power cannot adequately address environmental challenges that require systematic changes in economic priorities and production methods. Environmental sustainability may thus require fundamental democratization of economic decision-making that gives communities genuine control over environmental resources and development policies that affect their long-term health and welfare. The educational implications of environmental crisis emphasize the importance of developing ecological literacy, systems thinking, and critical analysis of corporate power alongside scientific knowledge about environmental processes and problems. Traditional environmental education that focuses on individual behavior change and technological solutions may inadvertently obscure the systematic nature of environmental problems while promoting false solutions that serve corporate interests. Effective environmental education should include analysis of political and economic systems that drive environmental destruction while developing capacities for collective action and alternative institution building that can address environmental challenges at appropriate scales. The integration of environmental education with broader education for democratic citizenship provides necessary foundations for movements that can achieve both environmental sustainability and social justice through fundamental changes in economic and political institutions. Contemporary environmental challenges, including climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and resource depletion, require urgent action that may be incompatible with current institutions and power relationships, suggesting the need for systematic social transformation that connects environmental and social justice movements. The window for preventing catastrophic climate change continues to narrow, while political institutions remain captured by corporate interests that profit from continued fossil fuel use and environmental destruction. The environmental crisis thus becomes a lens through which to examine broader failures of democratic institutions and the need for alternative social arrangements that can prioritize long-term human welfare and ecological health over short-term corporate profits. Chomsky's environmental analysis ultimately suggests that environmental sustainability and human freedom may be inseparable goals that require coordinated movements for economic democracy, international cooperation and rational social planning that transcends current limitations of corporate-dominated political systems. Part 15. Legacy, Critiques and Future Directions. The intellectual legacy of Noam Chomsky spans multiple generations of scholars and activists who have extended, refined, and sometimes fundamentally challenged his contributions to linguistics, political analysis, and philosophy of mind. His influence can be measured not only through citation counts and academic honors, but through the research programs he initiated, the institutional changes he helped bring about, and the intellectual frameworks he developed for understanding language, power, and human nature. The breadth of his impact reflects both the scope of his interests and the systematic nature of his approach to investigating fundamental questions about human cognitive capacities and social organization. Contemporary scholars working in fields ranging from theoretical linguistics to media studies to cognitive science continue to engage with theoretical frameworks and analytical methods that originated in Chomsky's work, though often in ways that significantly modify or challenge his original formulations. The linguistic legacy reveals both the transformative impact of generative grammar and the ongoing controversies surrounding its theoretical foundations and empirical claims. The mathematical formalization of grammatical analysis that Chomsky pioneered established linguistics as a rigorous scientific discipline while influencing research methods in cognitive psychology, computer science, and neuroscience. However, contemporary developments in computational linguistics, corpus studies, and usage-based approaches to grammar have challenged central assumptions about the need for innate grammatical principles while demonstrating alternative approaches to understanding language structure and acquisition. The emergence of large language models that achieve impressive performance without explicit grammatical knowledge raises questions about the psychological reality of generative grammatical theories, while potentially supporting alternative approaches that emphasize statistical learning and contextual processing over rule-based computation. The political legacy encompasses both direct influence on activist movements and indirect influence on critical thinking about media, power, and democratic institutions among broader populations. The propaganda model continues to provide analytical frameworks for understanding media bias while inspiring alternative media projects and critical media literacy initiatives. Chomsky's foreign policy analyses have influenced anti-war movements, solidarity campaigns, and international human rights advocacy, while contributing to broader public skepticism about official government narratives and military interventions. However, critics argue that his political analysis sometimes exhibits blind spots regarding authoritarian leftist regimes, and that his anarchist ideals may provide insufficient guidance for practical political organizing and institution building in contemporary contexts. The philosophical legacy involves ongoing debates about rationalism versus empiricism, the nature of human knowledge, and the relationship between biological and cultural factors in human development. His arguments about the poverty of stimulus and the need for innate constraints on learning continue to influence research in developmental psychology, cognitive science, and philosophy of mind. However, contemporary developments in machine learning, neural network models, and embodied cognition research have challenged strong nativist claims while suggesting alternative approaches that emphasize the role of environmental structure and general learning mechanisms. The debate between nativist and empiricist approaches to cognitive development remains active and unresolved, with implications extending beyond academic psychology to educational policy, artificial intelligence research, and understanding of human nature. The critique of Chomsky's linguistic theories has intensified with the emergence of alternative approaches that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of grammatical knowledge and language acquisition. Usage-based linguistics argues that grammatical patterns emerge from frequency effects and contextual learning rather than from innate grammatical principles, while construction grammar proposes that grammatical knowledge consists of learned constructions rather than abstract rules and representations. Cross-linguistic research has revealed greater diversity in grammatical systems than universal grammar theory initially predicted, leading to debates about the extent and nature of linguistic universals. Computational models of language acquisition demonstrate that statistical learning mechanisms can extract complex patterns from linguistic input without requiring innate grammatical constraints, though debates continue about whether such models capture all aspects of human language acquisition. The critique of Chomsky's political analysis focuses on several areas, including his treatment of socialist and communist regimes, his analysis of media systems, and his prescriptions for political action. Critics argue that his focus on American imperial power sometimes leads to insufficient attention to authoritarian practices by regimes that oppose American foreign policy, creating apparent double standards in moral evaluation. Media scholars have questioned whether the propaganda model adequately accounts for the diversity and independence of contemporary media systems, while critics of his anarchist politics argue that his ideals provide insufficient guidance for practical political organizing and policy advocacy. However, defenders respond that such criticisms often misunderstand the scope and purpose of his analysis, while failing to engage seriously with the systematic nature of his empirical research and theoretical frameworks. The contemporary relevance of Chomsky's work becomes evident in current debates about artificial intelligence, social media, climate change, and democratic governance that reflect ongoing concerns about power, knowledge, and human nature. His analysis of manufacturing consent provides frameworks for understanding social media manipulation and the spread of misinformation in digital environments. His arguments about innate cognitive constraints inform debates about the capabilities and limitations of artificial intelligence systems, while his political analysis offers tools for understanding contemporary authoritarianism and corporate power. Environmental crisis and growing economic inequality raise questions about democratic institutions and social organization that connect directly with themes in his political philosophy and analysis of power structures. The future directions for research inspired by Chomsky's work involve both theoretical developments that extend his insights and empirical investigations that test his hypotheses using new methods and technologies. Advances in neuroscience and neuroimaging provide opportunities for investigating the neural implementation of linguistic and cognitive capacities, while computational modeling offers tools for testing theories about learning mechanisms and representational structures. Cross-cultural research can evaluate claims about universality, while longitudinal studies of language acquisition and cognitive development can test predictions about developmental trajectories and critical periods. Political analysis, informed by Chomsky's approach, can investigate contemporary forms of media manipulation, corporate power, and democratic participation while exploring alternative institutional arrangements that might better serve human needs for freedom and dignity. The integration of Chomsky's various contributions suggests directions for future research that bridge linguistic, political, and philosophical concerns through investigation of human nature and its implications for social organization. Understanding the biological foundations of human cognitive capacities may inform analysis of educational institutions, democratic participation, and cultural transmission, while investigation of power structures and social control can illuminate constraints on human development and self-realization. The relationship between individual cognitive capacities and collective social arrangements remains an underdeveloped area that could benefit from interdisciplinary research combining insights from linguistics, political science, and moral philosophy. Future work might investigate how particular forms of social organization enhance or constrain the development and expression of human cognitive and creative capacities, while exploring institutional arrangements that could better serve human flourishing. The ultimate significance of Chomsky's intellectual contributions may lie not in any particular theoretical formulation or political position, but in his demonstration of how rigorous intellectual work can be combined with moral commitment and social engagement. His example shows how scholars can maintain scientific integrity while addressing urgent social and political questions, how specialized knowledge can serve broader human needs rather than merely advancing academic careers. The integration of theoretical innovation with empirical research and political activism provides a model for intellectual engagement that transcends disciplinary boundaries while maintaining commitment to both truth and justice. Future generations of scholars and activists will undoubtedly modify, extend, and sometimes reject specific aspects of Chomsky's work, while potentially drawing inspiration from his demonstration that rigorous intellectual inquiry and moral engagement can be mutually reinforcing rather than contradictory endeavors in the ongoing human struggle to understand ourselves and create more just and sustainable forms of social organization.